Hello and good evening, and welcome to UK Crime Book Club. And I'm delighted to be joined this evening by author Tom Mead, and he's going to be talking about his book Death and the Conjurer. Tom is a UK crime fiction author, and he specialises in lock room mysteries. Good evening, Tom. Thank you for joining us. So, Death and the Conjurer is your first novel featuring the magician detective Joseph Spector. Would you like to tell us about the book? Gorgeous, isn't it? Mm.
Exclusively locked rooms. And he had a real knack for coming up with original and elaborate puzzles. Um, so it's set in 1930s London.
Yeah.
It features Joseph Spector, who's my detective character. I've used him in a few short stories
Mm.
previously, but this is the first novel that I've put him in. He's very much in the mold of the kind of amateur sleuth from the Golden Age. So if you think of Hercule Poirot, Lord Peter
Yeah.
Wimsey, this kind of character archetype. But he's a retired musical magician who's recruited by Scotland Yard to help them solve a string of seemingly impossible crimes. So we've got two murders, two locked room murders, and the theft of a painting that are all mysteriously connected.
Definitely, and it's really really clever. And Joseph Spector is a really interesting character, and I too love the Golden Age. Agatha Christie is one of my favorite authors, and I haven't actually heard of the one that you said. I think that's I will have to
Yeah.
check them out because
Yeah,
I
John Dixon Carr, yes, he is. He's very much of the era. He's an American author, but very much a kind of very much a part of the British
mm,
school of crime writing. He came to England he came to England in the pre-war years. He previously studied in France, but he was very much an Anglophile and a fan of people like G.K. Chesterton of the Father
yeah,
Brown
yeah,
stories. And yeah, he was one of the first Americans to be admitted to the Detection Club, the sort of prestigious
yeah.
organization for crime writers. So a very interesting figure. He married an English woman, so though he's an American, I think he's very much part of the British school.
Yeah.
So in the vein of your Agatha Christie's, but with a style that was all his own, that was heavily influenced by the sort of gothic and macabre as well. So think
That does sound interesting.
Edgar Allan Poe, that kind of thing.
Mm. Really interesting. And because actually when I was reading, so I, as I said to you earlier, I listened to Death and the Conjurer on Audible, which was really entertaining and I really enjoyed it. But actually Joseph, I thought the voice of Joseph, it came over as all, I did think it was a bit spooky, like he was a bit spooky, he was a bit, I don't know whether
Yeah.
it was just his manner, but there was just something about him that felt a bit like, oh,
Well, yeah, I mean, I quite like a detective character to be a little bit, have a kind of sort of an uncanny element to them. So Agatha Christie, she had a great series, The Mysterious Mr. Quinn, of short
Yeah.
stories with this kind of this detective character who has an almost supernatural air to them. They're a bit kind of eerie and uncanny and a bit
Yeah.
weird. But also another favorite of mine is that there's an American author called Edward D. Hoke, spelled Hoch, but pronounced Hoke, and
Oh,
he specialized exclusively in short fiction. Really, he wrote a couple of novels, but he wrote over, well, roughly 1,000 short stories in his
wow.
50 year career. Um, so he had many different series characters, but one that I like the most is called Simon Ark, and he's a kind of a sort of nomadic, mysterious figure who kind of drifts in, rather like Mr. Quinn. But the stories are narrated by a Watson type of character, and Simon Ark, he kind of, we don't know if he's supernatural, if he's kind of the
Um,
interesting thing is that the mysteries are all uh, grounded in the real world. They're sort of that they have logical explanations, but the detective has something otherworldly about him. So that's kind of um, an interesting kind of juxtaposition. And
yeah.
Spectre, I quite like because obviously he's a professional magician.
Yeah.
So they deliberately try and cultivate an air of sort of the weird and the macabre about them. So it's just fun to write about that kind of character.
And was that sort of your thinking when did you always know that your detective was going to be a magician? Is magic something that you're interested in, or was it?
I am very interested. I do read a lot of non-fiction about the history of magic and illusion and things,
Mhm.
and I'm reading a great book at the moment called Slate of Mind, as in Slate of Hand. But it's about the sort of neurological processes involved in illusions and how they work on the brain. So
Yeah.
how basically how people can be caught out by tricks and
Tricks.
optical
Yeah.
illusions and kind of cognitive cognitive tricks that magicians play on, and I find that very interesting. But really, it strikes me when I'm reading about magic that it's really sort of analogous with murder mysteries, because in the same way that a magician performs in front of an audience and is actively trying to misdirect them, the mystery writer is doing the same thing. So I think
Yeah.
they have a lot of, there's
Yeah.
a lot of parallels between them.
Yeah.
So
I
it
never
just
thought
seems
about
like a
that.
natural kind of overlap. Um, and um, and also I am a big fan of magic and the history of magic. I'm there's a kind of tradition of magic in mystery fiction as well, which I've had a lot of fun discovering. My
Mm.
introduction to it was probably Jonathan Creek, the TV
I was going to
series.
say Jonathan Creek.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is I mean, I grew up watching that. You know, it's a great show which has legitimate kind of fair play puzzle and locked room plots, but
Mm.
also it's got that magic element in it. But I mean, it goes back further. Clayton Rawson is a name that I would definitely recommend if you're interested in that kind of thing. Um, he was a friend of John Dixon Carr, but he was a magician and a mystery writer. He wrote a series with a magician detective called The Great Merlini, and it was. They're really interesting. They're great books. They're really kind of pacey read. They're very sort of uh, kind of quick fire with their there's a lot of sharp dialogue and kind of quips between the narrator and the magician character, and the mysteries are really brilliant and elaborate. The first of them is probably the best. It's called Death from a Top Hat, and but
You'd have to
my
write all
my
these down.
yeah, but I mean, my favourites are the short stories of Clayton
Mm,
Rawson. And like I say, he and John Dixon Carr were great friends. Carr, for me, though he wasn't a magician, he's got a command of atmosphere and the kind of the sense of the gothic, which is maybe
mm.
not in the Clayton Rawson books. So that's why he's my favorite. But Clayton Rawson still has got a lot to recommend him, and if you like the kind of complex plots, he's really brilliant at it.
Because I think that's, yeah, I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you was about the complex plot, because I listened to it, and
Mm.
as you said, you've got two murders, you've got the theft of the painting, and they're
Mm.
all, so was it difficult to keep track of the plot as you were writing, and did you sort of have to write it, did you write it separately, or did it sort of flow as one,
Y-
story, or?
Yeah, I did. I mean, obviously, I came up with each individual little gimmick
Yeah,
on its own in isolation, so to speak, and then it was a matter of coming up with the kind of the kind of broader plot structure that
yeah,
the gimmicks will fit into, and just
mm,
kind of just basically writing and rewriting until you couldn't see the join, basically. That was the idea anyway. Just to kind of come up with these individual crimes, and
yeah,
then sort of thread them into a more elaborate
weave them together,
overarching
yeah.
plot. Yeah. So that was the idea. I mean, whether it works, I can't say, but that's the thinking behind it.
Oh, it definitely does work, and I think that was the thing. When, as a reader, I was thinking, well, how did you do that, and how did you sort of keep a track of it all? Because actually, there's a lot going on. There's
There is.
a lot of plots that sort of cross over, and people are, I said to you when we did our little sort of trailer, I said that I was like, well, is that person the same as that person, or is that person someone else, or
Yeah. I mean,
and
that's
it's
part
really
of the
clever.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's part of the fun of it. I mean, another great element of the golden age mystery that appeals to me as a reader is this idea of the writer setting a challenge for the reader, and it becoming
yeah,
that, playing up that kind of game element of it, and it being a case of, can you solve the mystery before the detective type of thing. And with that in mind, obviously it's essential to at least try and play fair with the reader by
yeah,
putting the clues in there. um it's so yeah, so I've tried to do that as well, but the main things for me with the locked room mystery and the golden age are the fun, elaborate plots.
yeah,
So often they can be a bit fantastical, almost surreal, with the kind of the sequence of strange, seemingly supernatural events that
yeah,
are then unraveled in a logical way.
yeah.
And the cast of
It's functional.
cast of sort of lively, colourful characters. But then also at the other end of the scale, for me, it's the a sense of atmosphere that I really appreciate,
Yeah.
which is, again, I've said it before, but that's the thing that Carr is really good at, and that is
Mm.
conjuring a sense of eeriness and just sort of strangeness that kind of draws you in, because it sets up a problem that seems impossible, but of course you as the reader know that it isn't. You know that there's going to be a logical explanation, but along the way it kind of with Carr at his best. So his probably his best probably my favorite locked room mystery of his is the Hollow Man, and there are numerous references to it in Death and the Conjurer, and the basic premise, the locked room mystery, the setup is similar in Death and the Conjurer. But the thing with the Hollow Man is that he piles on the weirdness and the impossibilities. So the deeper you get into it, that it feels like the less you understand it. So that when it comes to the conclusion and the veil is lifted, so to speak, the revelation is so much more dramatic and so much more satisfying as a reader. So I'm trying to kind of channel all the things that I enjoy about Carr's work,
Yeah, that
about the
definitely
Tom
works
Mead.
for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, a favorite phrase of mine is retrospective illumination. And that is the kind of sensation that you want to evoke in the reader, a sense that when they reach the end, they are thinking, of course, you
Oh,
know, of
yes.
course it had to be that, but why didn't I spot it, you know? So yeah, so that's the kind of thing that appeals to me as a reader, and that's what I'm trying to do with the Spectre series.
So we've got some comments on the chat. So we had a little tech issue at the beginning, Tom, that I don't think you saw, which was you weren't on the screen. I was.
Oh no.
So in a minute, I want going to get you to show your book again, because I think we missed you showing
yes,
your book.
yes.
So
Well, I'll show it to you now. Here it is.
there goes. So if you missed Tom showing his book earlier, there is Tom
yes,
and
with
his
its
book.
fabulous gold foiling cover. I do love the cover very much.
So we've got Laura here, Caroline, both saying hello. And Laura said that, oh, it's on Kindle Unlimited at the moment, your book. So if anybody has Kindle Unlimited, you can pop over there and get a copy.
Absolutely.
So Caroline's asking, do you have a favorite magic trick?
Now that's a really great question. I write about a lot of magic tricks, but the ones that interest me the most are the ones that retain an element of mystery about them. So one of the early short stories that I wrote with Joseph Spector as a character was about the Indian rope trick, which is a trick, an illusion that remains sort of elusive, in that magicians over the centuries have tried to replicate it, but they've never managed to perform it exactly as it's described in the original Sanskrit, dating back, centuries. So that retains an element of mystery surrounding it, because in the various historical descriptions of it, the trick has to be performed outdoors and in broad daylight, which obviously you can't really do in this day and age without an element of digital trickery, for example. And of course also so that the rope effectively rises unaided into the air and then is climbed by the magician's assistant, who then disappears like that at the top of the rope. So it literally disappears into thin air, which obviously is impossible. But it's fun to try and come up with ways in which the trick could be achieved, combine it with a murder mystery, which I do in the Indian rope trick story. So the story, in effect, is about two rival magicians who have a bet with each other as to who can perform the closest iteration of the trick to its original version. And Joseph Spector, as the kind of elder statesman of stage magic, is brought in as the judge of this contest between the two rivals, and then obviously things develop from there and are complicated by murder and conspiracy and things. But really the jumping off point was the trick itself and my interest in it. But more generally speaking, the tricks that interest me the most are confidence tricks, scams. I quite like researching and reading about the various fake medium scams and fake seances. That's
Yeah.
a classic trope in golden age crime fiction as well. The
Agatha did other good ones.
sort of
Yeah.
phony medium with a kind of hokey seance setup, and that's the kind of thing that appears in Car. Agatha Christie uses it as well. Yeah, it's so that's the kind of thing that interests me, and also it ties into the world of magic because famously Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was an avowed believer in mediumship and this
Mm.
notion of contacting the dead. But then Harry Houdini, the famous magician, illusionist, escapologist, was he was a debunker. He went around exposing these phony mediums, and it's interesting to think that Conan Doyle, a proponent of logic and deduction in the character of Sherlock Holmes, was taken in by these characters, whereas Houdini, whose job was to cultivate a sense of mystery, was all
Yeah.
about lifting the veil and exposing the scams. So I think it's all kind of it all kind of threads together, and I find that really fascinating.
So one of the things you talked about was you obviously have written short stories. Were they are they published as a as a
No, not they're
no?
not published in a collection. That is something that I'm hoping I'll be able to get together in the not too distant future, because there are quite a few short stories with Spectre, and most of them
Mm.
center around an impossibility, like a phony haunting or something like that, tied up with a murder mystery. So I think if you read Death and the Conjurer, you'd probably get something out of the short stories as well.
Mm.
But they've appeared in a few magazines here in the UK and in the US, plus a number of anthologies from Flame Tree Press. But like I say, I am hoping that I'll be able to get them
Yeah.
together, so they're a bit easier for people to track down.
Was like Conan Doyle because his were sort of serialized, weren't they, in the papers to begin with, and
That's
then
it, yes, in the Strand.
yeah.
Yeah, so and Edward D. Hoke, who I mentioned before, who made his
Hmm.
living from writing short stories, he was famous as, I think, the only writer to have had a story in every issue of Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine for about from the 50s through to his death in 2008.
Wow.
So yeah, it was one of those things where he was such an institution, but also
Mm.
quite a rarity because he made his living from short stories
Well, yeah.
rather than novel length fiction.
And how did you find that move? Laura's asking, how did you find the move from short stories to novel length?
Well, really, it was the result of lockdown. Um, I had been writing a number of short stories whilst working full time. Then, inevitably, with the lockdown, I was working from home. I had a lot more time on my hands, as we all did. So
Yeah.
it was about escapism, to be honest, um, because I do love coming up with the plots. I love writing about that
Mm.
era, and I loved, coming up with the characters and thinking about the interplay between them, and just every aspect of it, really. But it was my first attempt at a longer form piece of
Mm.
fiction with Joseph Spector as a character. I tried writing novels and things before, I think, because I mean, I studied creative writing as a student, so it was, but it's something that comes with practice. I think
Yeah.
it takes a while to develop the kind of stamina to write a full length thing.
Mm.
And I mean, Death and the Conjurer as a book is it's not a long book, but there's a lot in it. In that vein, I
Absolutely.
think. I mean, in the Golden Age, books tended to be not as long as they are now. So it kind of harkens back to that. But
Yeah.
it's one of those things where I try to keep it concise in terms of the prose itself, because obviously the plot is there's a lot going on, so you
Yeah.
want to get that kind of balance. You don't want things to be you don't want to overcomplicate things needlessly.
No.
But I mean, during lockdown, it was very much a case of, setting myself a challenge just for the sake of enjoyment, really.
Yeah, I think we all needed that, didn't we? It was.
Of course, yes, yeah.
Did you? So I really enjoyed as well the sort of psychological, because you've obviously got Dr. Rees,
Yes, yeah,
who's the therapist, and his
yeah,
daughter, who's also a therapist,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I really sort of found that intriguing, the sort of that sort of element as well, and the fact that his clients, um, who we don't want to give too much away, but his clients are sort of very integral to the story.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right. Yeah. Well, I suppose I can give you a little outline of it for
yeah,
anybody who's interested in reading.
yeah,
So the first murder victim is a psychiatrist called Dr. Anselm Rees, who I mean, he's kind of a thinly veiled version of Sigmund Freud, basically, because
yeah,
obviously Freud famously came to live in London in the years just before the Second World War, so towards the end of his life, and so that was what sparked the idea for the character, because
mm,
it struck me that if we've got a kind of celebrity psychiatrist, as Freud was,
yeah,
world famous at that time, coming to London, and obviously living as a private citizen, but would he take on, I say, a handful of high society clients,
yeah,
and what kind of secrets is he going to be hearing from them, that kind of thing. So in the book, Dr. Rees takes on 3 patients, and they don't know they don't know each other's identities, but he's hearing all their secrets, of course. He's got an adult daughter who's also a psychiatrist, as did Freud, of course. His daughter Anna. So when Rees is murdered, obviously there are plenty of suspects, because you've got to look at the background of each of his patients. You've got to look at
yeah.
their individual stories, and yeah, that kind of everything kind of spirals out of that.
It does, and I think the sort of the characters I really liked. I liked Lydia. I thought she was very feisty and
Yeah,
independent, and she was quite before her time, wasn't she? In a way, as
yeah,
a
but yeah, absolutely. Again, she's sort of an amalgam of real life figures,
mm,
heavily fictionalized, of course, for
yeah,
the sake of the plot. But yeah, there's definitely bits of real life historical personages in there. I
yeah,
mean, she's not explicitly based on Anna Freud, but the fact that she's the psychiatrist's daughter, obviously
yeah,
there's a parallel there.
yeah,
Yes, and she's a fun character, because of course she's got a very complex relationship with her father.
mm,
She's um, I mean, we talk about Oedipus and Electra complex, all that kind of thing, very Freudian. But
yeah,
she is sort of in his shadow, and
yeah,
she's trying to sort of emerge from her father's shadow, which it adds a different kind of tone to certain elements of the plot. It gives things a slightly different resonance.
yeah. Well, I think it was really interesting. I found the fact that how, as you're reading the book and as Spectre gets brought in to help Inspector Flint,
Mm.
you're he basically puts everybody under suspicion, doesn't he? He's like
Mm.
everybody's a suspect,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
without with cause as well. He's so clever that he finds something that they've why they're like, but you're like, well, it can't be everybody. I think I went through everybody in the thing, everybody in the plot, thinking, well, it might be them or it might be them. And I'm really rubbish at like finding out who, you know. I always think if I don't, I mean, if I find out, then I think, well, if I can find out, anybody can find out.
Well, I mean, I mentioned before about setting a kind of challenge for the reader, which I do explicitly in the book. There's a point
Yeah,
where I sort of stop the proceedings and sort of
you
say,
do. Yeah.
sort of step outside of the story and
Yeah.
say, "You've got all the clues now. Can you solve the mystery?" type of thing.
I was like, no.
So, yeah, I know. I mean, that again is that again goes back to the golden age. That was something that I love
Mm,
in the works of Ellery Queen, the again American series of mystery novels written by two cousins, Frederick Dane and Manfred Lee, under the pseudonym Ellery Queen, and they are really sort of technical masterpieces when it comes to the plotting. They
mm,
are at their best. They are really flawless exercises in logical constructions, and they use devices like the challenge to the reader, and also the sort of the Martin Edwards calls it the clue finder at the end, where you where at the very end of the book you can sort of go, so this clue was planted here, and you can actually pinpoint where the clues are. So I wanted to kind of recapture that, just
yeah.
that sort of kind of tongue-in-cheek enjoyment of the plot itself, kind of
Yeah.
really playing up those aspects of it, and also kind of also directly engaging with the reader, and trying to trying to get them sort of actively involved in the plot and the detection, as well
Yeah.
as the characters and the dialogue.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, did you have a favorite character to write? Did you? I mean, obviously
Uh,
Joseph Spector is.
yeah, I mean, I did like writing about Reese, the psychiatrist, but obviously he dies quite early on in the
Yeah,
first sort of
yeah, that,
50 odd pages. But I think after the murder, his sort of he still looms large in the book as a character,
he does. Yeah.
and his impact on the different patients and on his daughter is kind of felt throughout. So I think I like that kind of character where you've got a murder victim, but even sort of from beyond the grave, they're still
But
kind
they're
of
still making a
they're
big impact in
still
the.
present there in the story. So yeah, I'd probably say him. Although all the characters have got something that I found interesting or
Yeah.
striking about them that I kind of that I tried to play up in their characterization.
Mm. Did you when you started the book, did you always know who the murderer was going to be, or did
Um,
did that sort of develop as you went through?
so um, it's sort of the plotting of the book was kind of a layered process in that I would suss out the locked room gimmicks and the impossibilities first without knowing
Yeah.
who was
Who did it?
responsible.
Yeah.
And then when it came to the more the overarching plot structure, then I was thinking more
Yeah.
about the interpersonal relationships, and I was sussing out who would actually be responsible. So coming up with the mysteries themselves, I didn't necessarily know who the murderer was at that point. Um,
Mm,
but then obviously as I was refining it and rewriting it,
yeah.
and making sure that it all threaded together in as neat a construction as I could come up with, then at that point of course I did know who'd done it, and I did have the whole thing mapped out from beginning to end.
Yeah. Because I mean, yes, I mean, I imagine that you are a plotter then when you're writing.
Yeah, definitely. For me, that's definitely a key factor for me. But at the same time, plot can be suggested by a place, a character, a line of dialogue. So the plot is definitely important,
Mm,
but for instance, I think atmosphere and plot, they are the two things for me, but they're not mutually exclusive. A lot of times the atmosphere is suggested by the plot, but also a sense of atmosphere can help to hone down the intricacies of a plot as well. So they kind of feed into each other, basically.
yeah, yeah. When you so you obviously you said you started writing the book in lockdown, and did you know then that it was going to be? Did you think it was going to be a standalone, or did you always sort of see it as, because you'd written the short stories, that you saw it being more of a series? So that
Well,
sort of
yeah, I wanted it to be a series, certainly. And I wrote the book beginning to end in draft form at that point. And then because all my favorite crime fiction authors wrote quite long running series. Obviously, Agatha Christie, Carr wrote 2 long running series with his detective characters, Gideon Fell and Henry Merivale. Ellery Queen, of course, the character Ellery Queen appears in tons of novels. So as soon as I finished the draft of this, I thought I'll get started straight away on the next one.
mhm,
Not really thinking too seriously about publication at that point,
yeah,
because again it was in lockdown. I was just it was the fun of it, really, and the enjoyment of writing about Spectre and about that era,
yeah,
and using what I'd learned about plotting and about constructing a novel from the classics that I was reading at that time. So yeah, when I finished writing Death and the Conjurer, I went straight into the next one. So I always had it in my mind that it would be a series. Um, yeah, it's a series that I'd happily go on writing, as long as I can keep coming up with stuff.
you can, yeah. And actually, Caroline has said, "What's next for you?" And I did see when I was doing my research that there is a book two. Can you
There
tell us
is.
anything about that? Or that's
Yes, I can
coming?
tell. Yes, I can tell you a bit about the sequel to Death and the Conjurer. It's called The Murder Wheel. It is again Joseph Spector drawn into a string of impossible crimes. This time backstage at the fictional Pomegranate Theatre, which appears in Death and the Conjurer, and so there are 1 or 2 characters who reappear from Death and the
Great.
Conjurer. It's about it's about a year set about a year after Death and the Conjurer, but it's the wheel in question is a Ferris wheel
Yeah, the fairground.
at a carnival. Yes, at a fairground,
Yeah.
exactly. And although that's really only a part of the impossibilities, but I also thought, as a title, I thought it was a neat kind of analogy for the plot itself, because it's
Mm.
structured in quite a cyclical way, in that when you reach the end, everything kind of comes back full circle. So the murder wheel is just a natural
Ah,
choice of
yes.
a
That's what.
title.
Yeah.
It's one of those titles with that interpretation, as well as the literal wheel itself.
Yeah.
um but yeah, Spectre and Flint are back. The one of the murders in question takes place backstage during a performance of a magic show, so it becomes heavily involved with the world of magic, perhaps more so than Death and the Conjurer. Spectre's roped in again because, of course, he's got his background as a performer. And yeah, we've got uh, a theatrical mystery as well, which is something else that I enjoy a lot. I'm a huge fan of theatre and theatrical mysteries. It's something that
Mm.
again is there throughout the golden age of mystery, really. Again, Agatha Christie,
Yeah.
so many of her titles are from Shakespeare, um, but also the theatre as a location, because you've got so many colourful characters
Yeah.
in a theatre. You've got your actors, of course, but then you've got your you've got the artists, you've got business people. It's just a place where so many different agendas collide in one
Yeah,
location.
definitely. Yeah, they do,
Yeah.
don't they? Because yeah, and I think actually, you only have to sort of think about like you said, like the Agatha Christie's
Mm.
or other crime mystery books where
Yeah,
that sort of
Maya
theatre element.
Marsh.
Yeah,
She was a director as well, and as well as a writer of mysteries, and several of her Inspector Allen books are
yeah.
set backstage or involve a cast of actors. So yeah, so again, it's a classic trope, but it's one that I really enjoy, and it's one that I wanted to try and do something new with.
Mm.
So and again, we've got the impossibilities. We've got some really quite bizarre crimes, but the rationale behind them again is there's a logic there, and the explanation is hopefully fair play. And again, I've got the challenge to the reader in there and the clue finder at the end. So yeah, so if you read Death and the Conjurer, hopefully you'll be interested in the second one as well.
I definitely will be, because I think I really liked Joseph. I thought he was. I said to you before, I thought he was sort of like a magical Poirot.
Yeah,
He sort of
absolutely.
he knows everything, doesn't he? He's really clever,
Yeah,
um, but he's also very astute in the fact that he can read. He sort of reads people, doesn't he? As well as sort of
yeah. And I mean, that kind of character type, the amateur detective who seems to know everything, is sort of deeply rooted in the golden age.
Mm,
You talked about Poirot, of course, but I mean, it goes back to Sherlock Holmes. It goes back to
yeah,
Peter Pan, Edgar Allan Poe's detective, and I think the interesting thing about those characters is that they sort of they embody our own kind of as readers. They sort of embody our kind of intellectual curiosity. They
yeah,
they uh, they exist almost outside of the story. They which is why I like the idea of a detective having an almost supernatural air to them. But I've deliberately kept him as a character quite vague in terms of his background.
yeah.
Just because I like, well, I mentioned Simon Ark already, and he's got that air of mystery about him. Also, Mr. Quinn,
Mm,
and I just think it helps to cultivate that sense of mystery around the detective as well, because of course you've got
yeah,
these complex problems, and you think it requires a character who's a bit extraordinary to solve them, to unravel them. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, and also, of course, it gives the reader a bit of scope to use their imagination and
Exactly.
to think what their interpretation of this character is, and I like that. A good recent example that I've been enjoying is Anthony Horowitz's Hawthorne series, where the
Oh, I
character
really like those.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's so great. But I mean, the interesting thing about Hawthorne is how sketchy his background is, and
Yeah.
as we get to know him, but I mean, even things like his accent, where he's from, we don't really know.
No.
He seems at some points he's got a kind of northern accent, other times he's from the south, and I appreciate that. I think that's a really kind of fun, enjoyable element. So with Spectre, I've deliberately kept things like his age a bit sketchy.
Well, I was going to
Uh,
say that about his
yeah,
age, because there's a bit in there, isn't it? When I
yeah,
think, is it when Lydia says something like she doesn't know how old he is, and sometimes he feels older than he is other times.
yeah. So again, it's him as a character kind of playing games.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's to his advantage if people think he's a kind of doddery old man, but other times he's much
greatly.
more astute, but also physically able. So he kind of plays up to that confusion.
Mm.
which I think again is something that you get in the Hawthorne books and in
Yeah.
a few other mystery series. So yeah, that's basically the rationale, the thinking behind the character.
Mm. I so we're talking, well, we're saying about sort of Anthony Horowitz, and obviously he's done quite a lot of sort of playwriting and things. And
Yeah.
if you were going to you know, have you got any thoughts about who, if there was ever made into a TV show or a film, who would play Joseph Spector? Have you got
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, I always, when I'm writing about the character, I'm always picturing a kind of combination between the two Hammer horror greats, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, obviously,
Yeah.
sadly both deceased, but that's what I'm picturing when I'm writing. I'm thinking
Mm,
someone with the kind of stature of a Christopher
that
Lee,
presence.
a kind of a
Yeah.
looming presence, but with the soft spoken and
Mm,
the kind of the features of Peter Cushing with the kind of piercing blue eyes, and you know, that fabulous soft spoken manner that he had in those films. So that's what I'm picturing. Realistically,
yeah,
thinking
that might
about,
not be possible, might
sadly not.
it?
But I mean, realistically, I the actors that I like are the ones that have a very kind of understated presence on screen.
Mm,
So I think of people like Bill Nye, who obviously
yeah,
he's everywhere at the moment because of
he
his
is. Yeah.
nomination. But I really loved his performance in the Limehouse Golem a few years ago. That was a great film based on the Peter Ackroyd novel, and
Mm,
I thought he was quite an unorthodox choice for that character, quite a sort of downbeat detective, whereas normally I think of him as being so sort of suave.
yeah.
But but it really worked in that performance, and so watching that film, he definitely got a sort of an air of
Oh,
spectre about him, that
yeah.
kind of unknowable, sort of mysterious,
Mm.
enigmatic quality. So yeah, he'd be terrific.
Yeah, no, he would. And I think he is a mystery himself, isn't he? I think that's the bit I liked about him as well, is that, you know, you said you've left him ambiguous, you know, you haven't given away too much about him.
No,
And I think
there's
that's, oh,
bits though, there's little hints that you can kind of, as the reader, try and piece together, and I
yeah,
think that's an enjoyable element as well.
it is, yeah. Um, so do you write full time now? Is that your, is it your day job, or is it still your sort of part-time job, or?
No, I do write full time now. I've been writing full time since July of 2021. So at that point, um, well, at that point, I was also doing some ghost writing, and also I've got a bit of I do a bit of translation work as well on the
Right.
side. But currently, with Death and the Conjurer just coming out here in the UK, it came out in the US back in July of 2022.
Oh, I
So
thought, sorry, my cat's crying. I'm just gonna have to let her out.
no, that's all right. But yeah.
She's decided to come into the bedroom with us and let her out, because that is
Oh,
typical of
that's
Suki,
for
sorry.
you. Yeah, no, that's all right. But yeah, so it came out in the US last summer.
Oh, it came out before.
So yeah, so there was a bit of a delay in it coming out here in the UK.
Mhm.
But since then, of course, I've been working on getting the second one ready for
Yeah.
publication, and I recently submitted the draft of the third one.
Wow.
So
Oh, wow,
yeah,
so you are really, yeah.
yeah. So it's so I haven't really got time for anything else at the moment.
No,
Yeah.
no. So that's interesting that it came out in America first, because that's quite, is that
Mm.
sort of, was that Head of Zeus as well, or is
No,
it
no,
different?
it's
No.
Mysterious Press in America, which is run by Otto Penzler, who he's a big name as an editor in putting together really fabulous anthologies and things. So one of my stories was picked by Lee Child for his Best Mysteries anthology of 2021. So
Oh,
that
wow.
was what put me in touch with Otto Penzler, and he's
Yeah.
edited tons of anthologies, including several locked room mystery collections.
Mhm.
And so I knew he was a fan of the genre. So I thought
Yeah.
it was a case of just chancing my arm and just getting in touch with him and
Yeah.
saying, you know, do you want to read the manuscript? So yeah, it was pure serendipity, really, that he agreed to read it and then showed interest in it. So that's why it came out in America first. The whole thing was a bit backward in that obviously I'm here in the
Yeah.
UK, but the fact that it came out in America first then meant that Mysterious Press effectively sold it to Head of Zeus over here. So the
Wow.
process was somewhat it was kind of the inverse of what it would normally be.
Yeah.
But now yeah, the second one comes out in America in July, and then it comes out over here in October. So
Great.
two in a year basically. Um,
Mm.
which, you know, it's a bit full on, but it's very exciting, of course, just to see the whole thing coming together.
Yeah.
And then, like I say, getting to grips with the third one.
Yeah.
And as soon as possible, I'll get cracking on the fourth one.
Because I was going, do you find that sort of inspiration because you have the sort of character now? You know, you've got the character and other
Mm.
characters. Obviously,
Yeah.
you said with the is the inspiration easier now to go? Okay, right. What's he going to do next, sort of thing?
Yeah, that's the kind of that. Yeah, I think so. But also, it's something that comes from my reading of Golden Age mysteries.
Mm,
Often, I will try and play along and try and suss out the mystery. If it's a
yeah.
particularly convoluted locked room mystery, I'll try and come up with a solution just for my own entertainment, which will inevitably be wrong. But sometimes even that incorrect solution can have the seed of an idea that I could use in something of my own.
Interesting.
So this is what I mean about having that kind of, as a writer, having that relationship with the reader. At the same
Mm,
time, as a reader myself, I'm finding that I'm getting ideas that aren't necessarily in the book that I'm reading, but they're sparked by something about the plot
useful.
or
Yeah.
the characters. Yeah. So yeah, it's so that's basically how I try and how I come up with things. You can't. It's not an exact science, of course, but it's worked for me in terms of generating that initial idea.
Yeah. Caroline said, you know, you share a love of golden age fiction. Do you have a favorite book from then? Is have you got because you mentioned John
Yeah,
Dixon
I
Carr?
mean,
So
John Dixon Carr is he's my personal favorite. I can run through a few recommendations. The Hollow Man is the one that had the most direct influence on me when I was writing Death and the
mhm,
Conjurer, just because the solution is such a is so audacious and so kind of bold. But it makes logical sense when you get to it. But
yeah,
there's no way that you'd work it out.
you do it. No.
But I was just completely blindsided when I read it for the first time. And so when I'm writing, I'm really trying to kind of create that same sensation that I got
Mm,
when I was reading The Hollow Man. Agatha Christie, she she didn't write too many locked room mysteries, but the ones she did are very good. Hercule Poirot's Christmas is the one that's the most like a conventional locked room mystery, and of course, mysteries set at Christmas are
yeah,
such a huge thing anyway, because it's got a natural kind of built-in atmosphere with the snow lying on the ground, and
yeah,
we're in kind of a creaky old mansion. So
yeah,
that's a terrific book, which is probably easier to come by than the John Dixon Cars, although they are coming steadily back into print. But then one or two more obscure titles. I mentioned Clayton Rawson, Death from a Top Hat. That's a good one if you're interested in magic in mystery fiction. But then there's another name who, again, was a contemporary of the Golden Age greats, but a comparatively obscure one. His real name was Henning Nelms. He was a magician, a professional conjurer, and he wrote 2 locked room murder mystery novels, which are just really fantastic. He wrote them
Mm.
under a pseudonym, Hake Talbot, and the first one is very good, but the second one, which is called Rim of the Pit, is a really fantastically atmospheric novel. It follows an ill-fated group of characters who are on a sojourn out in the countryside during winter, and they're in a snowbound cabin
Oh wow,
in
that
the
sounds
woods.
cool.
And yeah, and it's it's got everything. It's got a phony seance, which I talked about
You
previously.
did.
It's got all kinds of locked room tricks and impossibilities, and a seemingly phantom killer. So yeah, as locked room mysteries go, that is definitely one of the best, and I think possibly the best that was not written by John Dixon Carr. I think he was the
Mm,
best writer overall, but Rim of the Pit has got everything that I love about Carr in it as well. So that's a great one. And just to go beyond the Golden Age,
yeah.
recently I can really recommend the French author Paul Alter, Halter. He's got a string of fantastic impossible crime novels, which are translated and published in English by Locked Room International, which is a very small press that specializes in locked room mysteries. It's based in New York, and they've done tons of his novels. And discovering his work, like me, he's a huge fan of Carr,
Yeah.
and that really shows. But he's also got that kind of sense of the gothic, which I love in Carr.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really like the Gothic, and I think the Gothic novels are they're very sort of in again at the moment. I think,
Yeah.
I think there was a time where sort of, I think like, so Mark Gatiss has done the M.R. James, hasn't he, over
Yeah.
Christmas, and they've sort of had a bit of a renaissance, and I think,
Mm,
that sort of ghostly mystery sort of. I like the supernatural element, is it real? Is it not real? Like you
that's
said,
it.
the
That's
hookies,
it.
and I
That's
think
what I
that's
love, that kind of blurring of boundaries. But then, of course, in a locked room mystery, a sort of orthodox locked room mystery, you've got a fully logical explanation at the end, which
yeah.
gives you that kind of retrospective illumination that I talked about, of everything falling neatly into place. So it's a tricky balance, but when it's done right by people like Carr, Christie does it, and Paul Alter, then
Hmm.
it's there's nothing like it really. It's I just love it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, Tom. It's been so interesting. And
My pleasure.
if
Thanks for having me.
you'd like to wave the book again, so for
With
anybody who
pleasure.
missed,
Yes, here it
so
is.
Death
Death
and the
and the
Conjurer is
Conjurer.
out now. It's on Kindle Unlimited. It's on in all good bookshops, your
Yes,
libraries.
Waterstones. You name it.
And it's also on Audible, which I listen to, and yeah, and I definitely recommend it. And thank you for coming along. If you would like to join us for other chats, have a look on the Facebook page. They're all listed there. And good luck, Tom, with book 2, which is coming out in October.
October. That's right.
So you have to come and have another chat and tell us about
I
what's
look forward to it. Yes, I'll be putting some updates on my Twitter at Tom Mead Author, or you can find me on
brilliant.
Facebook as well.
Great. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks very much. Bye.